This is one that was suggested to me via social media and piqued my interest immediately as I recalled watching it on TV back in the 80s with my dad. So I looked forward to getting my hands on a copy and reliving my childhood viewing experience. Unfortunately, though, the original 10-part series is either extremely hard to find or not available anywhere, which left me with a condensed two-part made for DVD version. So I guess this is a disclaimer to allow for missing a few things here and there that have been left out, and I can't recall 35 years since I last watched it. Based on the story of the Cowra Breakout, which occurred on August the 5th, 1944, during World War II in Australia. The series, which aired on the 10 network in Australia, follows a group of Japanese prisoners of war who were being held at the Cowra Prisoner of War camp in New South Wales. They're growing increasingly frustrated and experience feelings of hopelessness and desperation due to their incarceration, which has denied them the opportunity of an honourable death in battle. Their frustration grows as they hear more and more about prolific losses of Japanese troops to Allied forces in the Pacific Theatre. As a result, a group of the prisoners plan and execute a daring escape, hoping to return to Japan and continue fighting in the war. The series explores themes of war, loyalty, and sacrifice, and was well received at the time for its accurate portrayal of the historical event and the emotional complexity of the characters involved. What really happened? The Cowra Breakout was a significant event in Australian military history involving a mass escape of over 1,100 Japanese prisoners of war. The Cowra POW camp held mostly Japanese soldiers who had been captured in the Pacific Theatre of War, although it also held Italians who were much more resigned to a life of captivity and as such were given greater opportunities to assimilate into the local community and have further privileges. And I believe, and there's conflicting information regarding this, that there were German prisoners there as well, and perhaps some so-called illegal alien enemy of the state type situations with some Germans as well. In the early hours of August the 5th, the POW staged breakout using improvised weapons and makeshift ladders to climb over the barbed wire fences, shouting "Banzai" as they ran towards the perimeter fence. The breakout was met with swift and deadly force by the Australian Guards, who had been warned of the possibility of an escape attempt, but were a bit reluctant to do anything about it until it actually happened. The Guards opened fire on escaping prisoners, killing approximately 230 of them, along with 4 Australian soldiers who were killed by the escaping prisoners during the escape. After the breakout, the surviving POWs were recaptured, with many moved to the feared Hay camp, and the Cowra camp was closed. This was a tragic event that highlighted the desperation of Japanese soldiers held in captivity and the harshness of the conditions they faced. Although, having said that, the way they treated prisoners in their camps was a hell of a lot worse. This also did lead to changes in the treatment of POWs in Australia as well, with a greater emphasis on rehabilitation and humane treatment. Who made it? Filming was largely undertaken at Kennedy Miller's studios at King's Cross in Sydney and at Singleton Army Barracks, following an intense workshopping of cast and some of the crew. 6 Japanese actors had central roles as well. The famous Kennedy Miller partnership of Mad Max fame was responsible for production, with Philip Noyce of The Bone Collector, Sliver, and Patriot Games, and Chris Noonan, Babe, in the Vietnam series of 1987 directing. Noyce and Noonan were also part of the writing team with Russell Braddon, who wrote a book about Nancy Wake, Margaret Kelly, and Sally Gibson, both of whom I can't find too much information about on Wikipedia, unfortunately. Music was composed by William Motzing and cinematography by Jeff Burton. Bernard Hides and his design team did do a great job of recreating the camp and period look of the various buildings used, as well as having an excellent array of accuracy regarding the vehicles, from what I can understand. I can't find any information regarding the budget and can't really imagine it taking in much of a profit, if any at all. And having said that, it was on-sold to Great Britain and Japan, where it achieved the same moderate success as it did in Australia. Who's in it? Monahisha Fujita as Minami. He was in Into the Sun with Steven Seagal. Junichi Ishida as Junji Hayashi. He's in Marco Polo and Zodiac Killers. Alan David Lee as Stan Davidson, who's probably the main protagonist of the whole thing. He's in Prisoner, Water Rats, Blue Healers, and McLeod's Daughters, among other things. Andrew Lloyd is Lieutenant and later Captain McDonald. I can't find any other acting credits for him anywhere. And his character was an absolute piece of shit anyway, so I'm not overly fussed if he didn't go far after this. Tracy Mann is Sally Murphy, and Tracy was one of the most prolific and underrated Aussie actors of the 80s. She was in the Sullivans, Cop Shop, and the Cyclone Tracy series, among hundreds of other acting credits from the 80s and also in the 90s as well. Dennis Miller as Mick Murphy, who doesn't appear in the DVD version, but is more prominent in the original series. He was in Matlock Police and Dirtwater Dynasty. And another main actor in it was Kazuhiro Murayama as Komatsu. And he was also in Prisoners of the Sun and The Great Raid. What they got right. They got a hell of a lot right, from events to the uniforms, equipment, and just the general vibe. Obviously, some liberties have to be taken, particularly when it comes to changing character names and the like. According to the closing credits, many ex-prisoners and guards of the Cowra POW camp assisted the production and research for this television series, which is also stated on IMDb, so it must be pretty accurate. The closing epilogue states, on 2nd of March 1946, the Japanese ship Daikai Maru steamed out of Sydney Harbour carrying the surviving Cowra prisoners. 3 weeks later, they disembarked onto an empty wharf in Japan and disappeared into Japanese society. Many have never told their friends, their wives, or their children that they were prisoners of war. This is completely true and accurate. And I think ultimately the shame of losing the war and the shame of being prisoners and whatnot obviously would have weighed heavily on their minds, considering they had a huge honour system in their culture. And I know a lot of our boys didn't want to talk about the war either, and we have a completely different set of culture here in Australia as well. But yeah, it must have been a pretty horrific scenario, building up all that pent up memories and I guess more than 2 years prior to the events of this series, a prison break at Featherston, New Zealand resulted in increased security measures across other camps in Australia and New Zealand. This is referred to accurately, although the timeline is somewhat condensed, obviously to fit it in with the timeline of the series. And on several occasions, it is used in the series as a motivating factor by the prisoners, just as it was in real life. According to historian Gavin Long, the attack began at approximately 2 a.m. when a Japanese individual ran to the camp gates and shouted what appeared to be a warning to the sentries. Shortly after, a Japanese bugle sounded and a sentry fired a warning shot. 3 groups of prisoners then began breaking through the wire fences, with one group approaching from the north, another from the west, and a third from the south. The prisoners were armed with weapons such as knives, baseball bats, and studded clubs. And the reason they had baseball bats was because that was a sport they were allowed to play in the camp, and baseball was massive in Japan, as it still is now. So they had a lot of those available. A group of 545 Japanese soldiers attacked a machine gun nest and then roamed around the outback of New South Wales before eventually surrendering. The incident resulted in an estimated 234 Japanese deaths and 108 wounded. All of this is covered in enough detail, even if it feels like there were only 30 to 50 Japanese prisoners in the camp. But that is most likely just down to budgetary restraints, I would have thought. The authorities had already been informed of the impending breakout and had planned to transport the Japanese prisoners to Hay, when they escaped. So that was another motivating factor for the escape itself. Once again, both of these points are depicted, even if there was some artistic license used in the portrayal. Contrary to popular belief, Japanese soldiers are not likely to have committed ritual suicide over the shame of being captured. Instead, they were told to expect torture and inhumane conditions similar to those experienced by the Allied detainees in Burma at the hands of the Japanese themselves. While it is true that individual incidents may not have always demonstrated humanity, treatment of Japanese as well as the Italian and German prisoners was generally pretty humane. The series does do a pretty good job of showing the generally humane treatment, as well as having one specific Italian prisoner working and mixing with the public. Obviously, there was a lot more than that, but again, budget and that sort of thing would have held that back on having more. Plus, it wasn't really applicable to the story they were trying to convey, with it being more about the Japanese prisoners. Although I do recall from watching it on TV that one of the Japanese guys was actually Korean. You don't see that in the DVD version, but I'm pretty sure he was the guy that in real life was warning the Australians that there was going to be something going on prior to it happening. Don't see it in the DVD version though, so if you're lucky enough to get the original version, you might capture that. Conversations among some characters do emphasize the difference of attitudes towards the European prisoners compared to the Japanese, which is categorically true. And I will say that I don't recall seeing any other Italians, as I said, than the one guy, or any Germans at all. Don't feel it's too much of a distraction, as I already said, they aren't paramount to the story. Uniform wise, as far as I can see, it's very period correct for the Australian soldiers and for the prisoners. It's also good to see that the prison camp guards were either older men or those who were either returned from active service after being wounded or contracting illness, such as malaria and the like, from the tropical jungles, as that is exactly how it was. This also flows into the use of green, untrained troops being recruited into the search parties, and in some cases being afraid of conflict when it arises. That's all in there, and it's accurate. That's how it happened. Equipment is pretty good and reflective of what the Australians had at the time in the army, in particular. There's a Bren machine gun up in the guard tower, a Vickers machine gun as well, which is central to the breakout set piece and correct to history. The Aussie soldiers and guards are using Lee Enfield Mark III rifles as well, which would be true to form, as despite the Mark IV being used overseas, it wasn't in use at home to the best of my knowledge. In the battle scenes that don't make it to the DVD cut, and this is just my memory, that I was probably a bit of a rivet counter at the age of 11 when I first watched this. So don't hate me. The American troops were using Thompson submachine guns and M1 Garand rifles, while the Aussies are using the aforementioned Lee Enfields and an Owen submachine gun. It's totally spot on for the time in that theatre of operation in New Guinea. I do recall my grandfather telling me about the Owen submachine gun when I asked him about it. He fought in New Guinea, and he said that that was definitely in use at the time. So they got that right. I really like how the producers made sure you can differentiate between the Bren and Vickers machine guns during the breakout scenes as well. It's a nice attention to detail for my liking, and something that Kennedy and Miller are known for throughout their many projects. They love getting things right, and we're all the better for it. I'm not totally up to speed on the vehicles used and can't get much information online. However, the various cars and Davidson's motorbike are definitely 1940s wartime vintage. The trucks look like it too, but look, to be honest, I'm not, as I said, not 100% sure. Maybe you can hit me up in the comments and let me know. To be fair, there wasn't a lot that was wrong enough to be a nuisance when viewing. Obviously, there's a fictional characters rather than the 100% representation of those involved. But in my opinion, it's not a huge issue. As I did say earlier, though, they could have shown a larger amount of prisoners and a greater involvement of the Italians and Germans. And yeah, in the DVD cut, We really needed to see that Korean guy who was forced to fight for the Japanese and become a prisoner. He was there originally, so yeah. My own question is, where did he go, and why didn't they include him in the DVD cut? From research, it's my understanding that the troops called in to recover escapees were not armed when rounding them up in the series, so many of them are, and they go on to shoot a few of the Japanese. I can see why it was done, whether I agree with it or not. It doesn't hurt the series narrative. Probably makes it a bit more dramatic and exciting for the viewers. Other than those minor alterations, I feel like they got everything else fairly spot on. Big deal breaker for me though with the DVD version is having all but a brief couple of seconds of the war scenes in New Guinea cut out. From what I recall seeing on TV, there was a fair amount of it, and possibly even as many as 5 episodes in total. And I feel it would have helped establish the ongoing story a bit better and make us feel more sympathy for Mick Murphy. It was referred to in many conversations between Davidson and Murphy's widow, Sally. Plus, cutting all that out means that great Aussie actor Peter Phelps of The Light Horseman and Stingers fame is not seen at all by anyone viewing it for the first time on DVD. And that's a big shame because he's a great actor. My favourite moments. It's one of those shows where nothing really jumps out as an outright favourite moment specifically, while also having a good flow to it that makes it interesting. I think the authenticity of everything I've already mentioned makes it enjoyable for me in an overall sense. However, I have decided to single out a couple of scenes, both of which are when the two biggest pieces of shit get their comeuppance. Firstly, Lieutenant MacDonald is murdered somewhat ironically by some of the escaped prisoners. He was a captain by then. Don't really care. He's an asshole. To me, what makes this so satisfying goes back to the fighting in New Guinea, where he leaves his men for dead and runs like a coward, but then makes a false report claiming to be a hero and is awarded a military medal. I can excuse the butting of heads he has with Davidson at various times. However, his gung ho attitude towards using guns against the prisoners early on in his time at the camp, during the breakout, and then while rounding up the escapees, just leaves him open to what he eventually gets. The other one is when Shimiyama, played by Kenji Isamura, is finally exposed as a cowardly piece of shit and takes his own life. From the time he arrived at the camp, he was an agitator to the guards and his fellow prisoners, constantly trying to incite trouble. He ends up being the main antagonist in pushing for a breakout, except that when the time comes and it happens, he shits himself and hides inside a hut. He still takes a cowardly way out rather than the honourable death he was preaching to the rest of the Japanese about, and ultimately ends up with the blood of 230 odd men on his shit stained hands. And another scene that did make me laugh a bit was just before the breakout, when Davidson is visiting Sally and informs her that it was he who ended her husband Mick's life, explaining how he had to do it due to Mick's wounds received in battle. That part obviously wasn't very funny itself, but the very next second where Davidson and Sally start shoving their tongues down each other's throats was pretty hilarious given the circumstances. Overall, I did enjoy watching the Cowra Breakout both when it was on TV in my town in 1986, and again when I viewed it for this episode on the DVD version. I really think the production team did a good job of following the original story, maintaining a healthy level of authenticity and showing a reasonable amount of sympathy and empathy for both the Australians and Japanese when either of the contrasting emotions were required. For its time and possible low budget, it stands up well enough and is still highly watchable nearly 40 years later, in my opinion. And for me, I like the fact that a lot of not so well known actors played so many of the more notable roles, doing it as well as they did. Kind of a prelude to the formula that eventually worked so well in more modern TV series like Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and Our World War, just to name a couple that most people would have heard of. So, yeah, if you have an interest in learning about Australian military history and more specifically the impact World War II had on the home front, you can watch the Cowra Breakout on YouTube or potentially find a DVD copy somewhere online. I liked it, and I think you will too. I give it a 6 out of 10. Probably could have taken it up to a 7. if I had the full version available to me now. So that's it. So if you enjoyed this review of the Cowra Breakout, feel free to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications and all that usual stuff. And we'll have another review coming to you in the coming weeks. Until then, we'll see you.